Before we get started today, as always, we would like to do a land acknowledgement. Washington State University, Pullman is located on the ancestral homelands of the Palouse people and on the ceded lands of the Nimiipuu or the Nez Perce tribe. I think this is extremely important as we are a land-grant institution and we need to recognize our history in hopes of moving forward in a way that's reconciliatory and thoughtful and affirming for the folks who took care of this land before we were here. Additionally, this event is hosted in conjunction with Cougs Vote. And please vote if you are able. It's coming soon. Feels like forever and ever of talking about it, and it's nearly here. So I'm going to start out with a little introduction of myself and free speech and how it's impacted me, and student protests have impacted me. And then I will get to introduce our incredible panelists, Mark, Lauren, and Kiala. So before I get too far in, I want to let you know that I am the director of the Gender Identity Expression and Sexual Orientation Resource Center. Use he, him, his pronouns, and I've been in Pullman a long, long time. And I was starting to think a lot about student protests and free speech. And, I don't think that we can ever divorce ourselves from where we're from. And so I'm from Ohio, born and raised until I was in my early 20s when I moved here. And something that's been very important to me is remembering Kent State. And so on May 4th of 1970, at the Kent State University campus, 4 students were killed during a large protest on their campus by the National Guardsmen. They were protesting the Vietnam War. This really shook higher education, probably to its core to some extent, with hundreds of schools either shutting down or calling in the guard, et cetera. And so having gone to school in Ohio, I constantly think about how that was handled, how poorly that was handled, and how it has impacted people to this day. Like I have a staff member who's like, I was in college when this happened. And you can't forget that, right? And so there's still these histories with guardsmen on campuses, et cetera. On a more personal note, I remember when I was studying abroad and we were going, to another country and we were told, unlike in the United States, where you have pretty liberal freedom to say what you want and gather together and assemble how you please. You as a non-citizen in this other country do not, I repeat, do not have that ability or authority to do that. And they had a student that had gone to some sort of protest a couple years prior and ended up in a jail, which luckily they got out of, but it was a little dicey for a while, it seemed. And then more recently, I have seen how student protests, while I've not necessarily been involved in any, I've seen how it's really impacted our communities here at WSU. So I've been here 9 or so years now, and I've been in this role for about a little over 3. And so I started in June of 2017, and in August of 2017, the first week of school, there was a massive student protest in French Leidy. I don't know if Lauren or Kiala were here for that, but I know many of the others on this call might have remembered this or participated potentially too. And it was this huge moment of, this is what we've asked for, this is what we're demanding. And there were 5 student demands, and those led into working groups. I got to co-chair one of those working groups because I was, tightly coupled with gender inclusion and trans support, which made sense for what I do for a living. And we really worked on changing the campus climate. I mean, some things are a little bit harder to see because they're so far out. But every time I think about how all new buildings and all major renovations at WSU will be required to have a gender inclusive bathroom, I think it's because those students stood up and said, this is what we need for our community, right? And it was these intersectional coalitions across folks of color and students who identified as queer, et cetera, who came together and said, like, we need to work together to accomplish, change for our campus. So this is very near and dear to my heart. And so I'm excited to hear what everyone has to say and the questions that will come in. I'm gonna start with some bios. So Marco English is WSU's university archivist and has now been helping researchers explore the university's history for nearly 20 years. He's written on the university's early days and regularly shares the history of our campus, its mascots, and its traditions in classes, papers, presentations, and the media. Though never a protester himself, he became interested in WSU's student activism while researching the campus's 1960-1970 student protests for a fall 2016 exhibit, which was set up during the Trump wall protest and during numerous other activities reflecting student feelings about the issues of the Clinton-Trump election. So welcome, Mark. I'm gonna do all bios first, and then we'll come back for introductory statements from each panelist. I'm going to do Lauren next. Lauren Slater is a senior studying political science here at Washington State University. She works as both a social justice peer educator and a senator for the College of Arts and Sciences. Throughout her time educating others on social justice, she has taught many workshops, including identifying microaggressions and inclusive language. She's thrilled to have the opportunity to discuss the First Amendment and social justice today. Welcome, Lauren. And Kiala. Welcome, Kiala. Kiala Shaw is a Community Partnerships Assistant and Chair of the Advisory Board at the Center for Civic Engagement. She's also the president of both Alpha Phi Sigma and the Criminal Justice Club on the WCU Pullman campus. So, welcome, everyone. My first statement question for you all is, would you please tell us about your interest and work with the First Amendment? And we'll start with Mark and go probably the same order for this first question.
Well, my interest in this is pretty much historical because that's how I'm introduced to this. I get to see the student protests in the 1890s and the 1930s and the 1970s. I've never been, like I said in the introduction, never been a protester myself, never been an activist any more than your average instructor is an activist in their own way. But I do get to see in some of these cases, particularly the 1960s stuff, the drastic changes that happened in the university between just like 1968 and 1970 and how the university reacts to racial issues on campus, which I pretty much 98% attribute to that student activism, the students standing up, taking a risk and speaking out on these things and raising the awareness so the university responds to it and changes what they do.
Thank you, Mark.
Yeah.
Lauren.
Hello, everyone. Interest in work with the First Amendment. Well, as somebody that lives in Portland, I go to college in Pullman, but I live for the most part in Portland. I have tried to be very active in the Black Lives Matter movement that is happening in Portland, going to the peaceful protesting, supporting and amplifying Black voices, and just trying to educate those who maybe don't understand the movement. I, as a political science major, love and I work with the First Amendment a lot. I definitely think that it is one of the most engaging and important amendments that we do have. And like Matthew said before, it is a privilege that we have as American citizens. And I'm thankful every single day that we do have the right to voice our opinions and we do have the right to petition our government. And I'm super excited to discuss more about how it relates with social justice. And thank you.
Thanks, Lauren. I'm also very appreciative because I have a lot of opinions that I like to share. So, Kiala?
Hi, everyone. So yeah, as everyone said, it is a privilege that we do have the First Amendment. For me, what interests me the most is that I'm super into criminal justice reform. So not only have I had like personal experience with family members like entering the system, but just through my undergraduate studies, I've been able to like witness kind of how disproportionately African Americans are sentenced. And so that kind of relates to the Black Lives Matter movement, just seeing people come together and, you know, fight the injustices of our world. And, you know, whether the protests are effective and, you know, drastic change, it's seen. And so that's exposure. And it's kind of the first stepping stone for, you know, future conversations on, you know, these ideas. And something that's so cool about being in college is that universities, you know, are a platform for different, you know, demographics of students to come together on issues that they want to fight for. And so I think it's really important that, you know, we all take this seriously because, again, you know, not everyone has the, you know, right to, you know, say as they want or even to vote too.
Oh, thank you, Kiala. And I think what I think about what you just said is colleges are microcosms of our society, right? They're kind of like these cool little incubators that are seeing the same issues, but we get to engage with these issues in a very different way. So I have a question for Mark. So I'm going to start with a couple of questions that I just came up with out of your things. But Mark, are the protests of today all that much different than those of yesteryear? You're talking about protests in the 1890s, the 1930s, and the 60s and 70s. And do you see similar struggles in what folks are looking at today as back then?
There is, if you go way back, 1890s, 1930s, probably before the 1969, 70 protests, the students are definitely a little more restrained in what they do. I can only really think of a couple examples on campus where there was blatant marches like you might see today, which I think just speaks to the time. Everybody was more dignified, is not quite the right way to say it, but a little bit more restrained in how they reacted. I'm pretty sure that out of the 1892 protests here on campus, we had some of the students expelled for their actions, but I'm not quite sure how you're going to argue that, as a protest per se. And I can show you some of this history a little bit later if you like. But yeah, we tended to start with things a lot more along the lines of petitions, and the university, the students were expected to be the children to the parents of the university. Whereas today, I think a lot more we see the students as partners in the university as a way. So you would have to do something pretty strong to get expelled for protesting today, where it probably did happen in the 1890s.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Yes, and Local Parentis has definitely changed since the early days, right, of higher education. Lauren, I would love for you, and maybe Kyla and Mark, if you have some opinions too, but Lauren, you mentioned social justice in your introduction, and I am just really curious. A lot of folks say that the First Amendment and social justice have this tension between them, right? Because people can say whatever they darn well please. And yet we hold this value of social justice and equity and care for each other. And where do you see those connections? Where do you see that tension? Whatever else you might want to add.
Definitely. I think that there's a huge correlation. At first, a lot of people were very confused while I was a political science major and also working as a social justice peer educator. And I think that they really go hand in hand. I think that both really amplify each other. With the First Amendment, I mean, you do have the freedom of religion, speech, press, petition, and assembly. Each of those are very, very important components of social justice. Making sure that you're petitioning your local, state, federal governments if you're seeing injustice, making sure that your voice is heard and making sure that others allow your voice to be heard. And also with assembly, making sure that if any of those other components don't work, that you're making your voice be heard, because it is a right that you are guaranteed as a US citizen. I do think that sometimes protests are a little misunderstood, and so is like the First Amendment. There are a lot of limitations to these rights, and I think that that's what we see a lot when we do see protests. The fact that there is limitation when it comes to disruption and breach of peace and disorderly conduct. And I think that it's a really interesting interaction. And honestly, I think that they do go hand in hand a lot of the times.
And yeah, if I could add off that too, I think that they do go hand in hand, but sometimes we have this, misconception that they conflict so much because we can just say whatever we want, but it's oftentimes like saying what you only follow, the people that say what you want to hear. And so when someone has a differing opinion, you're like, okay, First Amendment, can't say that, or, what we should constrict it now to saying, what we want it to be. So sometimes it can conflict, or, people just misinterpret, what we can say or what protests, we want to follow, because it's like, okay, well, I see this protest, but also it's not, in the best interest maybe for the entire country. So what do we do with that? How do we, restrict the First Amendment, or do we, or, how to go about that nature too?
Mark, did you want to add anything before my next question?
Sorry, no, I don't think so.
Okay. So Kyla, you just mentioned it, restricting the First Amendment. What are your thoughts on that? And it's for anyone, but you brought it up, and so I wanted to, like a talk show host, I wanted to really focus in there for a moment.
Yeah, so you know, I don't think we should restrict the First Amendment. I think, you know, regardless of if you believe, you know, what protests you want or, you know, vice versa, it's information, and that ultimately gives you kind of, you know, a more informed or you learn the information so that you can form your own decision. I think oftentimes too is that this is the first time where college students can have their own voice. Kind of compared to, you know, anyone in their family. You know, we grow up with certain values or beliefs that we just hold on to, and, you know, right is right, wrong is wrong, so we follow that. But then we get to college and we're able to see, you know, a different world or a different demographic, and then that allows us to create our own voice. So, you know, at the end of the day, even if you don't believe with a certain protest, it's information that you're learning to inform your own opinion on that, so we shouldn't restrict it.
Thank you, Kiara. Absolutely, right? We're all products of our raising, right? And if we haven't been given a lot of cognitive dissonance and opportunities to challenge our thinking, how do we ever grow and understand, you know, inquiry, right? And information literacy, et cetera. Lauren, did you have anything that you'd like to add?
Just that I full-heartedly agree. I think with social justice, a lot of the times it gets kind of like confused that it's like very one-sided. Especially as a political science major, I believe that everybody, regardless of who they are and like what they believe, do have the right to express their opinion. And I think especially on a college campus, it's very important, especially because, like I said, like I'm from Portland, which gives me a certain like set of views that I wouldn't understand if I lived in Eastern Washington. So I think that it's really important, especially on a college campus, not to restrict these freedom of speech, as long as we're being respectful and as long as it's more about like our views and not like targeting other people. I think that it is really beneficial to a college campus to have conflicting views and to be able to learn from each other. And I think that that's something that WSU especially has done especially well. And I think that it's pretty great that we have like the ability to have a pretty wide range of freedom of speech here on the campus.
Is Matthew frozen?
I think so.
I think we've lost Matthew.
I broke the system. Sorry.
So I don't know what happened to Matthew, but maybe, Mark, I wonder if you'd be willing, do you have examples, or I heard you might be able to share some photos of students from, WC students from the past?
Yeah, at one point you guys asked me to put together like a short little overview, just a couple minutes of campus protest. And if I can manage to share the screen, I've got like about 6 minutes in here. Let's see if this will work for me. Hopefully you're seeing something there that looks like a picture. Yes, okay, good. I saw somebody nod there. Yeah, so again, we've been around 128 years talking about a history of campus protests in 6 minutes. I'm gonna have to talk really fast. We usually think of like 1969, 1970, which is where this poster comes from in terms of students' unrest. But like I was saying earlier, it dates back to 1892. We started teaching classes in January 1892. I'd argue our first big student protest was December 1892. Which this is actually 1893. I couldn't quite get back to a photo of 1892. I'm not going to have photos of the 1892 protests for obvious reasons. But you picture campus as being about like this. That was our first dormitory under construction. Cabbage fields outside because we're an agricultural school. And what happened in 1892 is the Board of Regents decided to fire our first president, a guy named George Lilly. The students loved George Lilly, so they got together and they signed a petition, wrote up a petition signed by 99% of the student population. If you can imagine 99% of the student population agreeing to anything today. 99% of them signed this petition, sent it off to the Board of Regents, and the Board of Regents basically said, thank you, but we're the adults here, we know what we're doing, and fired George Lilly. About 3 weeks later, they came on campus with the new president, a guy named John Heston, and they were going to introduce John Heston to the student body at a large meeting. While the students were hanging around before, they started singing I guess it'd almost be protest songs, where they took common songs of the day and changed the lyrics to things like, "We'll hang Regent Smith from the old apple tree and have George Lilly as our president again." This made Regent Smith, the head of the Board of Regents, and President Heston uncomfortable, so they decided to leave and maybe come back at another time. So they tiptoed out of the building, where they met a whole bunch of students out front in this cabbage field in December. The students picked up cabbage leaves, snowballs, eggs, apparently dirt clods, whatever they could find, and pelted the incoming president and the head of the Board of Regents, chasing them all the way down the hill back to town. This is not really the kind of protesting I'm going to really suggest you guys take up. But oddly enough, it did have an effect. It got front page news all around the newspapers, all around the state. This article is the front page of the Olympia Tribune that day. And it got the attention of the state government. They launched an investigation into what the regents were doing, why they fired the president. The Board of Regents was removed and replaced, and John Heston retired 3 months later, resigned 3 months later, letting us kind of start from scratch, bring in President Bryan, who you guys may know from Bryan Hall, and really kind of relaunch the college and really let it rebuild itself. So that was kind of our first big protest. We had another one. This is a photograph from 1936. We had student protests, huge student marches going on campus in 1936. They were basically going on strike over social issues. They thought they were being treated as children. They thought they didn't have the social rights they should have, and they wanted this changed. They actually got together in Bowler Gym. They held a meeting and decided actually that they shouldn't go on strike because it would be rude. Very polite students back then. So President Holland ignored them. They had another meeting the next day, at which point they did go on strike and were marching through campus. This is taken from President Holland's window. You can see Hitler over Germany equals Holland over WSC. This is 1936. So Hitler was still kind of getting started a little bit, but we do not accept dictatorship. And that was very successful. You can see from the Evergreen the next day, all requests are granted. President Holland agreed with everything they did. So we tend to think of student protests in the 60s, but it's been going on all the way back to the earliest days. After the 30s, we had, of course, World War II, and the 50s were a quieter period. By the 60s, we started having small protests on campus, as you can see here. And then 69, 70 is probably our big year where we had marches all over campus. This particular one, they're marching from the campus to downtown. They are protesting racial issues, as you can see from a poster here depicting Uncle Sam as Chicano-American, Native American, and African-American. They're protesting the war. The US was involved in Vietnam, and the draft went into place in 1969, December. And the students were looking at getting lifted, well, not lifted out of school, but as soon as school ended, they'd be sent off to Vietnam and fight in the war. They're also looking at how migrant workers are being treated, agricultural workers. They don't think migrant workers are being given a fair shake in this country. And you see all sorts of stuff happening on campus. There are public presentations, teach-in speeches like this going on, events happening. This is a halftime at a basketball game where a number of students swarmed the court and raised their fist in a Black Power salute. Skits out on the Terrell Mall. The Bozo the Clown head here is supposed to represent President Terrell, the head of the president at that point in time. And it wasn't all entirely peaceful. They occupied Stadium Way at one point, and a car tried to slowly drive through or around, had a large 2x4 with nails in it thrown through the window of the car. Even more dramatically, someone lit fire to our football stadium in 1970 and burned half the football stadium to the ground. Yeah, another form of student protest I'm not going to recommend in this. It all kind of came to a head. Matthew mentioned Kent State there. In May of 1970, 4 students were killed by the National Guard, 4 protesters in Ohio. The following day, our students swarmed into French Ad building, took it over and said, "We're not going to give you your building back until President Terrell comes out, negotiates with us, agrees to our demands," which he did. He agreed to 2 demands, and the problem was the students came back, maybe not a problem, it's also a good thing, it worked out well. Students came back the following week with another list of 13 demands, which President Terrell either chose not to or could not meet. And we had a strike on campus for the last month of the school year in 1970, which was not resolved until Dead Week, when President Terrell and the students negotiated a settlement which worked out well for the both of them. After that, we've had a wide variety of protests going on, becoming very much more common, I think, in the last 20 years here. Some have been very quiet. Some of them have been very loud. Students standing up for their rights, students sitting in for their rights, students standing up for something, or students standing against something. We've had very conservative protests. We've had very liberal protests. And basically over the last 128 years, we've seen our students standing up for whatever issues matter to them in all sorts of ways. And that was my quick 6 minutes, 128 years of campus history. Oops, got to stop the share there. There we go.
That is incredible. I love the photos of the times that I've been here for. I'm like, oh yeah, yeah, I remember that one. And I remember that one.
They're still going on today. I was tempted to pull out. I don't know if this will hold up to the window, but this is the sit-in I think you were talking about from a Facebook post about 3 years ago now when you were here new. So it's a lot easier for us to maintain the old physical items than it is the electronic Facebook meetings and such not. But we try to keep that history around so everybody can, so it's still here in another 100 years.
Yeah, I was gonna say our archive is quite incredible.
There's a lot of fun stuff in here. I was kind of pulling out some things. I don't think I can really share any of the useful here, but I mean, the students have, there's a 1937 monstrously thick petition, which of all things, it's like 47 pages, I think, which is students asking, can we have Friday off after Thanksgiving so that we can have time to go home to see our families, those of us who are close enough. And I mean, we think of protest as a larger thing, or activism as a larger thing, but this was the students getting together, finding a way to approach the administration and say, look, this is important to us. This is something you can help us with. They're willing to stay an extra day at the end of the school year so they could have Friday off to have Thanksgiving with their families.
That's cool.
Yeah.
I know I didn't give folks, I got so excited about what you all were talking about for my first question. I didn't give you all some time to talk about kind of an intro piece. So Lauren or Kiala, if you want some time, there is some. I don't know if either of you wanted some more introductory space, but I wanted to create that since I took it away.
I can go. I was like, oh, who's gonna go first? Yeah, so hi, I'm Lauren Slater. I love the First Amendment and I love social justice and I love protesting. So I am really glad to be here and talk about it because I think it's really important, especially like right now. I think that there's a lot of misconceptions though, especially as I continue on in my studies and kind of learn more about what the First Amendment is, especially, I don't know, like there's just like a lot of people think that it is completely linear when it's actually like, it's very, very hard to discuss like the First Amendment in a non-complicated lecture type. I will say as students, we sometimes think that because we belong to an institution, that we have to be extra careful with what we say and how we approach injustice. And I wanted everyone here to know that they are protected by the First Amendment. It does protect US citizens. A famous quote by the Supreme Court says that students do not shed their constitutional rights to freedom of speech and expression at the schoolhouse gates. I think that this is really important. It's one of my favorite quotes that I've learned in my studies because like students are very powerful. People of our age, people of our generation, people of every generation, we have a voice and it's very important, especially with this election coming up. It's very important to get out there and have your voice be heard. We are the lowest like rates of voters, and I would like to see that changed this election. Regardless of who you vote for, get out there and vote. It's very important. It's one of our biggest privileges as US citizens. And I think that everybody should make sure if they are able to go out there. In every single state, we're seeing a bunch of different ways to vote due to COVID-19. And I think that it is important to check what your state is doing if you are not a Washington resident. Also, I wanted to note some of the limitations that our school has like described as the First Amendment. The First Amendment does not protect discriminatory harassment, fighting words, true threats, intimidation, disruption, breach of peace, disorderly conduct, and advocacy of illegal actions. I think that these are important just because when we are discussing the First Amendment, to kind of like understand like what are the limitations. And to conclude, I just hope everyone feels inspired to vote and get out there. And if they see something that isn't right, that they stand with the people who are experiencing injustice. If you're experiencing injustice, please reach out. We have so many wonderful spaces on this campus to reach out to. You can always reach out to my program, Social Justice Peer Educators. We are under the Office of Outreach and Education. We would love to hear from you and start a conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Lauren. I love that you used something from the Supreme Court about the First Amendment. My favorite thing is when they talk about obscenity and that you'll know it when you see it. So, Kiala?
Yeah, so just to kind of build off of what Lauren said, I know she had mentioned a little bit about the criminal justice system, which is a little bit of my expertise, but I think we focus on protesting and like, we all are thinking right now, like that's, the only way right now we can get involved, but it's just one way that we can. Your voice is heard in so many different ways. Kind of some of the work that I've been doing this semester is about the criminal justice system and racial issues kind of regarding incarceration of families and how that affects children, as well as, talking to previously incarcerated individuals that are, a person of color paired with an attorney of color to kind of see the two sides of the criminal justice system. And so, by doing that, I'm not protesting, but I'm having my voice be heard in a way that's different. And so I kind of just want to mention those events because if you're someone that wants more information, but you find that protesting is not exactly what you want to do, there's so many different ways to get involved. And I urge you to seek out that information. We're living in such a divisive world right now, but the benefit is that so many people are able to use their voices, especially with this upcoming election. Being able to vote, I just kind of want to mention, is just, it's like our constitutional right, but it's also a privilege that others do not necessarily have. When you're speaking for yourself, you're also speaking for other people. Your vote is a voice for undocumented students around you, for people who lost their privilege to vote. Another topic surrounding, having your rights is prison disenfranchisement. Offenders will go to prison, they'll come out and they lose their right to vote. And so they no longer are able to vote, and that's losing their voice in a sense. And so, with that in mind, whether you're for or against the topic, I would just recommend you think about how would you feel or react to losing, some of your constitutional rights. And then maybe you can acknowledge the importance of your vote as well.
Thank you, Kala, for bringing that up. I think that's so important that we often don't even think about unless we have someone who's close to us who may have been incarcerated and realize that many folks lose their right to vote. Also state dependent, I believe, too. All right, so back to my hard-hitting Barbara Walters kind of questions. How do you think student protest and or free speech on campuses has impacted you? I can go first and then I will kick it to someone else. Sorry, I don't want to just throw you a hard ball like that. I guess I'm not like Barbara Walters after all. I think for me, right, I know the history of my center and I know that came to be in a particular way through the administration, but there was no LGBT student org when GSORC had a different name at the time, was founded. They had one, there had been a lot of back and forth discourse in the student newspaper. The Daily Evergreen has kept impeccable records, or maybe Mark's area has kept impeccable records of the Daily Evergreen. And so we've gotten to see how people have talked about queer people over time and how they're don't give them any money, don't let them be a part of ASWCU. And there was a real clash of ideas around that. Something that we would maybe not think about very much now, but then was such a big deal, right? And so I know that our space wouldn't be here if it weren't for student protests and students pushing to have, representation in offices that supported identities that they hold.
I can go. I am a new student, well, not new student to WSU. I am a senior, but this is my second year here. I can honestly say I am so thankful for students that came before me to fight for my rights. I was diagnosed with bipolar 2, and because of the accommodations that I can receive from the school, and because of the wonderful people at the Access Center, and because of the inclusion that is on every single syllabus, the fact that I am guaranteed accommodations, I'm just so thankful that students before me have fought for that. I am thankful that because of these accommodations, I am able to be a senator. I am able to take full class loads. I am able to speak here today. Without that, I honestly could say, like, I don't know how I would have succeeded in college. And I am thankful that I am able to have the opportunity to speak here today and like be a platform for people that may be struggling like I was before I moved to this school. There are accommodations for everyone. The people at the Access Center are wonderful. And I am very thankful for the people that have protested before me, for the people who have talked to the administration before me, for the people that have stood up for people like me and everybody at the school with like disabilities, and letting them know that they matter and that they're seen and that they're visible. And that's kind of the thing that I really think about a lot when I think of freedom of speech and protesting, is how many components of our school life that we take for granted. As a woman, being able to go to a university, I think back like 100 years where women weren't afforded the opportunity to even like go to school, and like the process that had to happen for that to happen. So I'm just really thankful that this country like embraces their First Amendment rights. And I'm thankful that people fight even when it's not in group, even when it's just you see other people and you're like, hey, like they should be able to have the same opportunities as everyone else. And if this ever reaches a past student that like protested or made their voice heard to administration, I would like to thank them and thank the university for accepting those accommodations and making it easier for people who are like me to come to school here and succeed.
Lauren, that was incredible. Thank you so much for sharing. And I still, like, foolishly had forgotten all about the Deaf President Now movement in 1988 that really helped to usher in the American with Disabilities Act in the early 90s. And so thank you for reminding me of that. Yeah, Kiala, did you want to add anything?
I mean, I think Lauren, hit it nail on, but I would just, I would say like, I'm just so grateful for the opportunities that WSU has given me and allowed me to not be restricted in anything I've ever done. It's given me kind of the opportunity to go tour a prison if I wanted to, which, necessarily would be kind of weird and risk assessment, but I've had these opportunities to grow in, who I am and the career I am, and being restricted on a campus may not give anyone those opportunities. I've recently was a resident advisor, so I got to meet so many different people and, hear their stories. And, it could be, we could think about segregation and how, certain people have to live this way and that way, and you don't get to hear those stories. So I'm just super grateful that, we have co-ed, resident halls on campus, or, all female or all male to, accommodate so many different people, because without that, it would be so much more difficult for students to even attend a four-year university.
Great, thank you all. So first questions coming in, and we're starting to get some more. So thank you all for bringing those to us. So I want to talk a little bit about free speech zones and why they might exist. And so a free speech zone, it depends on the school and the location, but some institutions have very clear areas for free speech. Like, you're allowed to gather here at this time. Like, I have some colleagues at private schools, so like, there's a free speech hour from from noon to 1 p.m. on like Mondays. And that is when you can operate and use your, freedom of speech and expression, right? Whereas others, like Washington State, University has some pretty robust opportunities and locations for students to protest, right? And so does anyone want to talk a little bit about that? I know, Lauren, you've talked a little bit about what is somewhat limited, or like it's not a total free for all, but do you want to address the free speech zones at all?
Sure. I think certain schools that do have free speech zones, I definitely understand the thinking behind it. The fact that a limitation of it is if it's like disrupting. We're pretty privileged to have a bigger campus where if you're like in the courtyard and you're protesting, it wouldn't affect people in the south of the campus. And so I think that that also has something to do with it. And I think that we often have like these zones to ensure that we're not kind of like breaching those limitations. But I'm pretty thankful that like WCU has a pretty open, like kind of like First Amendment zone. They do have like some restrictions, of course, but we are pretty open when it comes to like the First Amendment.
Kiala or Mark, do you want to add anything? All right, so I want to make sure. I feel like I get like swept up and then I'm like, I don't want to lose any voices here. How would you explain the difference between free speech and hate speech? It seems to be a fine line. Anyone? Oh, it feels like we're playing a game of chicken.
No, you're okay.
Yeah.
I think I'll take that one on a little bit. I think sometimes if you have to ask that question, it might be considered like what you're saying that to yourself. Like if I'm going to say something, is this considered, free speech or hate speech? Maybe change it necessarily just because, you don't want to be on that kind of fine line. You want it to just be respectful. I think that's the most important thing is that when you're coming from a place of respect, it can't, it's more so free speech. I would say that hate speech is more threatening or harmful to someone. So if you're directing it at a specific person or a group, knowing that it could be harmful to them, that's kind of hate speech. I think if you're just saying it coming from I think this way, and so I'm going to say it, and I hope you take it in the most respectful way possible, then other people, whether they, receive it or not, it's still coming off respectful, and you can control that. You can't control everyone else's, feelings or emotions towards something, but you can control your own. So I would just say, focus on what you're saying, but, just be respectful. As long as you're respectful, I don't think it will come across as hate speech unless you're threatening.
And I would add, I've learned a lot about this over my time as one of the co-chairs for the community response team and trying to understand, I have a degree in Spanish and 2 degrees in education. And so like law isn't my like forte necessarily. And really thinking about how we've created some things that maybe don't exactly exist in law, right? Around there's protected speech and there's unprotected speech. And hate speech, while it is a thing and it impacts many people in my communities, it's not necessarily something that's covered, right? Or like it's not something like separate in the law from the protected versus unprotected. And so, kind of like Lauren, I think had mentioned earlier, right? Discriminatory harassment, for instance, would probably be considered hate speech and it's not really protected, right? But there are other things that are hateful, vile, not things that I would hope that Cougs would use with other Cougs that would still be considered protected speech. So I think that's where it gets really murky. And I think case law continues to illuminate ways in which a free speech can operate. So another great question came in. Do you believe these free speech zones should extend to more than just the students of the universities? For example, the people who put up signs of aborted fetuses on campus, even though many of them were not students. I will clarify one of our policies is that most of the events like this that happen on campus are in conjunction with student organizations. And so if a registered student organization is interested in hosting it, which I know which event you're talking about happened, I think last September, they were co-sponsored with a student organization. And they had to go through certain protocols because they put up signs. So there are abilities to be in freedom of speech and like have protests and gatherings and such, but to build stuff such as those large signs, they had to go through our certain risk assessments in order to put them up safely and to guard people's safety, physical safety at least. Lauren, Kayla, or Mark, did you want to add anything to that?
I would just say it's like kind of on the basis of like the restriction. If, you know, we're going to restrict one thing, we're going to have to restrict all things, and, you know, vice versa. And so, you know, although I remember that kind of protest, and it was, you know, pretty harmful for the people that, you know, witnessed it, but you take a look at it and it allowed you to kind of create your mindset or your views around a certain issue. So, you know, even though it was negative, you know, having to look at it maybe for some people, it allowed you to, you know, form a greater opinion on something that now may mean more to you. And so I would just say, look at it from the bright side. And, you know, some things we do have to deal with that we don't necessarily agree with, but it helps you, you know, grow as a person. So just not restricting it is probably the best bet.
I would agree with that. I think, like I previously said, like coming to a college campus, part of the reason that we do it and we don't just opt to go online, we're forced to go online now, but part of the reason why we don't opt to go online is because we do want to be exposed to these different opinions. And while it can be harmful, you know, like it's, if you are going to restrict, like it's been said, like if you are going to restrict like one thing, then you'd have to restrict everything, just because the school cannot like show favoritism, obviously. And I think that that's like pretty important. And I think it's something that I've had to experience a lot in my major as a political science student, because we all come into it with pretty like distinct opinions, or some of us have no opinions, but it's really important as you grow as a person, as most of us do throughout college, to form these opinions. And I think that often we think these people have like opinions that are like outside of us, you know, they're on social media or they're like far away from us and they're not real. And I think that them coming to like the school sponsored by a registered student organization kind of like shows that they are real, and these are like opinions that people do think. And I think that that's important as well, just to kind of like bring a little bit of reality to like the issues. And I think that that kind of relates to like voting as well, kind of like understanding that these are like real issues. And if you feel strongly about it, then vote against it. It's one of those like things that it really does impact students, and it impacts voting, and it impacts how we feel about policy. And I think that's pretty important.
Thank you, Lauren. I think what you also are getting at is that we can also get into our bubbles, right? Where we're not confronted with differing views on different topics. And so I think that's one great thing about being in Pullman and being on a college campus, is that there's always opportunities for your view to be challenged, and then potentially for you to really reinforce, like, yeah, I listened to this argument and that's not what I believe in, and I believe in this instead.
I'd argue that it's even more than that. It's your ability to engage with them. I mean, the abortion setup was obviously intended to shock people, and they could put that up online and you could avoid it or not avoid it. But when they're here in person defending what they're doing, for good or bad, it gives the students an opportunity to engage with it and potentially learn from them, potentially talk to them, potentially interact with the other students on other sides of it. It's not just exposure, it's engagement.
Oh, sorry. Do you think social media has been helpful or harmful in terms of spreading information and expression of the First Amendment?
Personally, I think that there are a lot of good elements of social media, such as it's a good platform for organizing, for collecting thoughts and ideas, sometimes for like debating different sides, because debating is a very big component of our democracy. That's why we do have panels like this, and that is why we also like do have like presidential debates. Like, we want to hear multiple sides of things, and it allows us, like Mark said, to engage, which is very important. What was the question again? I got on a tangent and forgot it. Social media.
Oh yeah.
Yes. But I do think that it can be harmful, especially like from like a mental health standpoint. Social media is really like hard just because your brain does get dopamine rushes from it. But it can be really harmful to political engagement as well, especially as we see now, people are extremely tired of like seeing it like on social media. It can cause a fatigue. I also think that, let's see, let me see the question. Oh yeah, so the spread of information, especially as a political science major that like studies law, it can be kind of like annoying when you see like misinformation a lot. Like a lot of the times, you see with like masks trying to quote like the like ADA, and it's often like misquoted or it's like taken out of context. And a lot of the times laws are presented one way, but when they're argued in like the Supreme Court or like when they're actually written, they have a different like meaning or like agenda or a way that it's interpreted. So I think it's hard when you are talking about like policies and like the First Amendment because they are so intricate and it can be really hard to convey them, especially when a lot of people just don't have like a full understanding of it, which just goes down to the fact that we're all getting misinformation and then it's like spreading. And so I think it can be really good and it can be really bad. So it's one of those things like, it's like kind of a catch-all, like, yeah.
Thank you, Lauren. Anyone else on that question? Okay, I'm curious how, with all of the things that are being said, you know, and protested and so much going on in the world, how do you recommend that folks care for themselves?
Because I just recently did it. As somebody that is like bipolar, I am very sensitive to a lot of like negativity. It can be extremely hard. And one of the things that we really preach through the social justice peer educator program is taking the time for self-care. Because if you are somebody that like wants to be an activist or get out there, you can't help others until like you help yourself. And self-care, I think, is one of the most important things that you can do as somebody that like wants to talk about the First Amendment or somebody that like wants to talk about social justice. And some of the ways that like I found that has been really impactful for myself is sometimes taking a few days and not looking at social media. It can be really hard. Our brains aren't really meant to absorb all this information all the time, especially like news and stuff. It can be very negative. And so sometimes just kind of taking a moment and being like, you know, like I'm just gonna focus like on myself. Like I want to focus on like going out and like actually interacting with like others and just kind of taking a break. I think that kind of goes into the other question of like social media is that it can be kind of damaging if you're just in that social media bubble. And that's one way that I've really found that it really like helps. And it's important to like stay updated and like watch the news and like be on social media for that. But it's also important to give yourself time to kind of just relax and to like just turn it off for like a day or two and just focus on yourself and what you're doing. Because at the end of the day, you can only control yourself.
And yeah, I would just add to that, it's okay to not have to, you know, it's okay not to be okay, but it's also okay to not engage in conversations that you don't want to. I know, especially we talk about, oh, Thanksgiving break's coming up, so we get to go home and talk about politics because it will be after the election. You don't have to engage in those conversations. If that hurts you mentally, take time for yourself. Lock yourself in your room if you have to. But yeah, just really like Lauren said, focus on yourself. You can't really help others until you help yourself. And so it's okay to be informed and go out and do so many different things, but make sure you're good because that can be so exhausting. And, you know, especially with protesting, be safe in those situations, you know, social distancing, of course, but just being safe. Like you never know what can happen with the protests. So, you know, thinking about the precautions prior to going or anything like that, so that you are, thinking about your well-being as well as, fighting for your cause.
We had a final question come in that I just, it's meaty. With freedom of speech considered, when debating someone who is stubborn and not wanting to listen to your side, how do you address this without being disrespectful? For example, you believe that Black Lives Matter and you're part of that, kind of teen camp, and your family is all lives matter.
For me, I get this a lot as I do work with social justice, and I am originally like from the South, which is, I think it's really nice because I do have like that kind of like that both perspectives of it. For me, one of the biggest things is that there's often a huge misconception. People often like aren't getting like the full story or the full reasoning when they see it, because the news often like sensationalizes it, like, oh, like Black Lives Matter means that Black Lives Matter more, or, you know, all lives matter is great because like all lives matter. When like in reality, when you explain the different like dynamics that kind of go into it, especially as we see with Blue Lives Matter, just kind of like for me, I always try to explain what the actual meaning is, kind of what I've done with explaining like defunding the police. Often there is kind of a disconnect in like information. Often they don't even know what it is. I had this exact discussion with my mom, and she didn't know what Black Lives Matter and All Lives Matter were really talking about. And so I would just first try to start off with like the definition and reasoning behind both. And if not, I mean, at the end of the day, sometimes you can't change others' opinions. And I think sometimes like you don't have to like accept that, but you also like don't hurt yourself trying to change other people. Like if someone's not gonna like listen to you, they're not gonna listen to you. And it's like difficult to kind of, I don't know, like end that discussion, because it's a discussion that should not be ended. But I think that it kind of goes in with like that self-care, that sometimes like you have to take a step back if it's gonna like hurt you. So that's kind of my answer to that.
And I would just add too, you know, when it comes to debating, you know, you feel like there's a winner and a loser, but that's not necessarily the case. I think specifically with that, you know, kind of Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter, you can say like, yes, all lives matter, but right now this movement is where we're at. And, you know, kind of base yourself off that, and, you know, acknowledging the other side and understanding, you know, allows you to be, you know, better off in the situation, because now you're looking at both sides. So again, you can't change other people's opinions sometimes, and that's okay. But as long as you're informed about, you know, both sides of the conversation, that makes you better off. And so I would just say, you know, focus on yourself and then getting the information, because, you know, you're going to do something with that they may only see one side, and they can't work well with all of that. And so you're going to be able to have more difficult conversations, because you're learning now that you can acknowledge the other side, but still believe another side, and, you know, show the points as to why, you know, your side may be better or not, you know.
I think offering questions that are more reflective, right? I had very similar conversation with some of my family recently, and they were like, well, wait until we see the video. And I was like, what do you think about due process? And do you think that's a right that we are all deserving of? And so coming back to things that tie in directly and yet an impact to our lives, right? I'm very glad we have due process, and talking through some of those other things that people don't realize are all part of this, right? I think movement. So I know we are at time right now, so I would love to thank the panelists that got to join me today, and I was so lucky to get to moderate with. So I know we can't really clap because we're in a webinar, but I give my deepest and most gracious thanks to the three of you for your time and your energy and your insights. I've learned a lot, and I will turn it over to David, I think, if he's got anything left.
Yeah, thank you very much, Matthew. I just sent in the chat how to get your hours tracked by the CCE for participating in this event.